Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today, we're going to be ranking all 30 monitors I tested and reviewed in 2023 in a tier list. You're probably familiar with what a tier list is and might have seen my previous rankings video I did at the end of last year, but if you're not, here's what it looks like. On the left-hand side, we have the tiers with the S tier at the top for the best monitors, down to the F tier at the bottom for the worst monitors. Last time, this video was pretty long, so I'm expecting something very similar today, and I'm not going to be speaking on each product for very long, so as always, check the full reviews if you want to get the full context about the products and how they perform. This tier list will feature rankings based on both overall performance and value at times, so products that were too expensive, going to be ranked a little lower, products that are a bit better value, going to be ranked a little higher, and of course, we will be discussing the best overall products as we go. And finally, before we get into it, this video is not really meant as a recommendations video, though I guess it will be interesting to see where all the products end up. Like last year, haven't pre-planned anything, but I would encourage you to watch the full best of monitor videos for proper recommendations and detailed thoughts about those sort of things. The main reason is that our recommendation videos talk about products from prior to 2023 that might still be good buys today, whereas this video is purely focused on the monitors that I have tested and reviewed in 2023. So let's get into it. So we'll start here with the Sony Inzone M3. This is a 27-inch 1080p 240Hz IPS monitor. And really, there wasn't a lot to like about this product. It had poor value. It was really expensive for a 1080p 240Hz monitor. And even if it was cheaper, it did have mediocre performance and missing features. No single overdrive mode experience, for example, average factory tuning. And I feel like if you're going to be offering a more premium monitor, you're probably going to need to include some of those sorts of features. So this is a monitor that I really couldn't recommend for most people. It wasn't, absolutely terrible and completely flawed like you might see from an F-tier monitor, but certainly couldn't recommend it too expensive and didn't have the performance required. So I think it belongs very much into the E tier. Next up, we have the HyperX Armada 25. This is a monitor that I did not make a full review on, but I did end up testing fully. And I didn't really want to make a review on it because there wasn't really all that much to say. It's a pretty average monitor. Also, I found it to be expensive for the specifications, not as bad as the Inzone. And I guess the price was sort of justified because it has the monitor arm mount that comes with it instead of a normal stand, like you can see in the picture. It was a little faster than the Inzone, average tuning, lacked a single overdrive mode experience. It just wasn't that amazing of a product. The fact that it was better than the Inzone, I think, means that it belongs into the D tier, and for people that need a dedicated monitor arm and wanted to buy a display at the same time, this might have made a little more sense, but overall, nothing too amazing there, and that is probably why I didn't make the review in the end. Next up, we have the PX248 Prime Advanced. So this is a monitor, again, that I didn't test, and this is because it's just your standard, basic, pretty typical, low-cost 1080p monitor. Not great in terms of its factory color performance, but it does have decent response times. It's sRGB only, so you're not getting anything overly fancy, pretty low brightness. It was pretty cheap as well. I think it was available for like $160, $170 US back when I tested it. Could be a little cheaper now. There's nothing all that much to say about this monitor. This is just your average 1080p entry-level monitor. It's fine. There's nothing too much more to say about that. I think it belongs into the C tier. Also that I tested is the PX257 Prime from Pixio. So this is meant to be a higher tier than the PX248 Prime Advanced. So typically it was available for a slightly higher price point, I think more around the $200 mark US. It did have better factory calibration than the previous Pixio, but worse motion performance. And I think if you're going to be offering a higher priced product and you're offering lesser motion performance, that to me is pretty hard to justify, and it ended up being a pretty average product. So I think somewhere into the D tier probably makes the most sense for me, something around there for that particular product. So nothing super special. When we look at the Lenovo Legion Y32P30, again, this monitor, it had good performance and nothing was overly outstanding about it. Pretty weak wide gamut support, average brightness and contrast, but it did have well-tuned motion performance, and you couldn't say that about all 32-inch 4K 144Hz IPS LCDs that I've tested. So compared to monitors from a couple of years ago that use 4K panels, this is certainly one of the better ones, and in that regard, I think I was reasonably impressed. But overall, for $750 US, this monitor was fine. Nothing overly special, just it was a fine monitor. Is it better than the PX248 Prime Advanced? Probably. It is a very different tier product though, much more expensive. I think in some regards, I probably would recommend it to some use cases. It depends what you want. So again, maybe pending re-rankings, I'd consider putting it into the B tier, but not 100% sure about that ranking. I think somewhere around there, B, C tier is probably where that Lenovo monitor belongs. Next up is the MSI G274QPF-QD, and this is a monitor that I did recommend for some buyers depending on the price and other circumstances. In terms of its overall performance, it's average to good. Motion performance, response time tuning, maybe mediocre, maybe average. It lacks a single overdrive mode experience, but that's also typical of sub $300 monitors, which the G274QPF-QD ended up being towards the end of its life, or at least the end of this year. I think it is still available, so not really the end of its life. Anyway, 27-inch 1440p 170Hz IPS, pretty weak contrast, but it does have great brightness. And I think one of the advantages of this monitor was that it offered a wide color gamut with quantum dot support, which often wasn't available around the $330 price point when I reviewed it. But over time, it went from typical to average value to now being pretty good value. You can often get it for around $260 US. And compared to other monitors around that price, it is quite competitive. So over time, it has gotten better, but it's nothing overly special. Like, it isn't breaking new ground. It isn't offering things that are significantly better than what you can get in that price point. So that's probably a B tier monitor. It is probably better than the Lenovo monitor. So I think I'll move the Lenovo down and slot in the MSI monitor ahead of it inside of the B tier. It's probably where I'd have things at the moment. Next up, the LG 27GR95QE. So this is a 27-inch 1440p 240Hz WOLED monitor. And I think of all the monitors that I tested in 2023 that used this panel, I think I tested 5 of them. This one would be the second best of those products. So across all of those monitors, you do get pretty similar performance. And this particular monitor had decent SDR brightness. However, HDR brightness, again, typical to a lot of the other monitors, but not as good as the Asus model, which we'll be ranking very soon. Excellent OLED performance as expected, black levels, motion performance, all very good from this type of product. It does have a few more unique features, I guess. HDMI 2.1 wasn't found on all of these WOLEDs. It also had hardware calibration support. However, things like text clarity and so on weren't amazing because of the OLED panel structure. I think over time, it launched at about $1,000 US, and it's now much more competitive in pricing. It was pretty competitive at launch because it was sort of the only product available. But now that we're in the back half of 2023, it is quite good value, especially in some regions. So I think with all of those factors combined, this is probably an A-tier monitor. I think it's one of the better products that used this panel throughout the year and could be worth buying in some circumstances, depending on exactly what you're after. If this was the only monitor that released with this panel throughout the year, like LG exclusively used their panel or something, we'd probably be looking at S-tier, but I know the PG27AQ-DM is probably destined for S tier. Next up, we have the MSI MEG342C, which is another QD OLED monitor, the first of the ones that we'll be ranking in 2023. This display offered similar performance to other QD OLED monitors that we've previously tested. Not quite as good as some of the Alienware models, but if you're talking about black levels, HDR brightness, motion performance, it's all pretty much a muchness depending on which of the QD OLEDs you get. Again, 34-inch 1440p class, 21:9 aspect ratio with a 175Hz refresh rate. There was a few interesting features here: KVM switch, HDMI 2.1, 65 watts of power delivery, and at launch, it had better HDR accuracy than the Alienware DWF model, but the DWF received a crucial firmware update throughout this year that I think would have put the Alienware back into the #1 position. And I think if I was thinking about sort of the issues with this product, the build quality is certainly one of them. Very unimpressive for an expensive $1,000 premium monitor, especially relative to a lot of the other QD OLEDs that I ended up testing throughout the year. It started off being one of the better value products. I think these days it's more standard in terms of its value. So based on that, based on its performance, I think this is a B tier monitor. Nothing overly amazing. However, again, I sort of look at these other products here. I'd probably recommend it over the Lenovo monitor. So let's slot the Lenovo into second place, and we'll slot, well, into third place. The MEG will advance into that position there. All right, next up, we've got the Corsair Xeneon Flex 45WQHD240. So this was a fairly unique design, 45-inch 1440p class, 21:9 aspect ratio, 240Hz W OLED. But the unique design aspect to this product was the fact that it had a flexible panel. So you could choose to either operate it as a flat panel for, say, productivity applications, and then convert it into a curved gaming screen to be used for things like, well, gaming. And you could choose up to, I believe, like an 800R curvature, which is pretty curved. So I think that idea is quite interesting. I think the idea is good because curved monitors aren't great for productivity, and at that size, you'd probably want to have it curved for gaming. So for a dual-use monitor, which a lot of monitors are these days, yeah, having this flexible design makes a lot of sense. However, the panel that was used for this product just didn't live up to that, promise and I guess capabilities that you'd be expecting. Because it was an OLED, it's not super suited to productivity tasks because of the risk of burn-in, and that was exacerbated by the lackluster SDR brightness and its very poor pixel density, only being 1440p class at a 45-inch size, plus the sub-pixel issues of WOLED meant that it was quite difficult to use as sort of a productivity display. Well, not necessarily difficult, but just not optimal, I think, if you were spending the sort of money that is required to buy the Xeneon Flex. And this was a very expensive monitor. It was priced at like $2,000 US, very expensive, which meant that for most people, I just couldn't really recommend it. I think it's interesting. So for example, normally with those level of specifications and performance, you'd be looking at probably like F tier, E tier being overall a fail. But I think because its design wasn't as much of a gimmick as I was expecting, could even be in the D tier. Again, it's not something I would recommend, and I think D tier is probably the products I generally wouldn't go straight to recommending. But because it's unique and interesting, I think it's probably worthy of a spot in this lineup here, and probably towards the bottom end of the D tier. So I'll put it into the D tier for now. Maybe we'll reevaluate that one later. Next up, we have the Samsung Odyssey OLED G8. This is probably one of the better QD OLEDs that I tested throughout the year. Again, performance is quite similar to the other QD OLED ultra-wides, this being, again, 34 inches, 1440p class, 21:9 aspect ratio, 175Hz refresh rate, with all the motion performance advantages, the black levels, HDR performance, 1000 nits, etc., that you get from that type of panel. So performance pretty similar to other QD OLEDs. It does have some unique advantages, those being things like the great color calibration experience with a lot of settings, tunability, thanks to its smart TV functionality. Is tunability a word? Well, we're going to coin that a word in this video today. It did have a few issues, things like HDR performance on AMD GPUs specifically wasn't up to scratch. It was expensive when it launched. It has become much better value as time has gone on. You can actually find it for below $1,000 US these days. The mini display connectors kind of sucks in that product. But the design I was quite impressed with. No fan noise, worked quite well, firmware update support. So I think this is probably one of the monitors that I would be more likely to recommend as far as the QD OLEDs go. Whether or not it's ahead of the 27GR95QE in the A tier, I think it's a much of a muchness between those two products because it really depends on whether you would go for, the 27-inch 16:9 aspect ratio or the 34-inch 21:9 aspect ratio. But either way, I think those products are worth buying. They are worth recommending. Probably not the best of the best, but certainly an A tier product, definitely quite good. When it comes to S tier products, the first one that we will be putting into that position today, and this is a fairly obvious choice, the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG27AQDM, a 27-inch 1440p 240Hz W OLED monitor like the 27GR95QE. But on this occasion, despite using the same panel, Asus managed to increase the brightness in key areas. So it has higher SDR brightness and the highest HDR brightness of any of the monitors I've tested using this panel. 35% brighter, actually, in real-world HDR use cases, which for a lot of people, I think would make it the go-to choice when buying this type of display. And for me, that is very much worthy of S-tier performance. It is expensive at $1,000. Some of the other WOLEDs eventually drop to more like $800 US, so you do have to pay a premium for the Asus model. It does lack things like HDMI 2.1, but I think overall, if you were looking for the best performance from this class of display, the PG27AQDM would be it. It is a great monitor. The BenQ XL2566K. This is a product that is difficult to rank because if we're looking at just what it sets out to do, which is to be a pro esports monitor, it's 24-inch 1080p 360Hz TN LCD. if you're just looking at it from that perspective, let's be a pro esports monitor, let's give great motion clarity. The XL2566K pretty much delivers on that. It really does have excellent motion clarity, especially if you're using the Diac Plus backlight strobing mode. It's really fast in terms of its response times. It has a high 360 Hz refresh rate. You're going to get the responsiveness of that. It really is very clear and great for those pro esports use cases. But for anyone else that is thinking of buying a general use monitor, you probably wouldn't buy this because it's expensive. It's only a 1080p resolution at a 24-inch size. It has poor color quality, terrible viewing angles, and yeah, it's just a niche product. Like, it's just designed for a certain type of gamer. So if I think about the sort of people that would buy this, I think I'd put it into the A tier, but below these other two products. I think what it sets out to achieve, it really does deliver on that promise. And a lot of gamers have been very satisfied. It's, looking at, the opinions of people that really value motion clarity, they've been very satisfied with the backlight strobing mode that this particular monitor, it's the whole reason why you'd buy that monitor. So yes, if I was personally ranking this, if I was thinking about the overall picture, you're probably looking at like a C tier monitor, maybe even a D tier if you really hate the T and viewing angles, but only pro gamers are going to be interested in this. And from that perspective, I think it's an A tier product. So yeah, that's probably where I'd have it. Probably one of the best 1080p monitors you can get. Next monitor to be ranked is the Asus ROG Strix XG27AQMR. And this is probably more of a surprise packet than I was expecting, especially after reevaluating it for some of the best of content towards the end of the year. This is a 27-inch 1440p 300 Hz IPS monitor, and I was impressed with this product when I first reviewed it because of its strong performance. So it was priced a little bit higher than you'd expect for a typical, high refresh rate 1440p monitor, but it delivered on that higher price because of its very strong performance. It had really good tuning with variable overdrive, so nice single overdrive mode experience. It had reasonable, though not amazing, backlight strobing, good color performance, good color controls. It was terrible HDR, but that's pretty much what you get in this price class. And I think it was fair value at launch, but since that it dropped from $650 US to more like $500 US towards the last couple of months of 2023, that actually makes it quite a good buy around that price point. If you're looking for that more premium, more performant version of a 1440p 240 Hz plus monitor, you can buy them for $350 US, $400 US typically, but if you're willing to spend that extra $100, you do get a better product. And I think the XG27AQMR delivers on that. So yeah, is it an A tier product? It's probably not as good as some of these OLED monitors. It's either low A tier or higher B tier. I think because for a lot of people, I would still recommend the more bang for buck options, that we're probably looking at the high B tier scenario. So I'm going to put it into the top position in the B tier. I think that's probably where I'd rank it. And yeah, we'll just go from there and see where the other monitors fall into line. Next up, Gigabyte G24F2. This is a 24-inch 1080p 180 Hz IPS monitor. And like a lot of the other 1080p monitors that we looked at earlier, some of these for example, this really isn't a standout option at the price. Pretty underwhelming response times, reasonable colors including wide gamut support, good contrast ratio, has a pretty great design in this class with things like height adjustable stand and pretty typical build quality to other Gigabyte monitors, especially some of their more premium monitors, and has a fair price, but it just isn't a standout option. I think there are some better 1080p monitors from previous years that I'd probably buy over this, and it really depends on the pricing in your region as to whether it's a solid buy or not. It is very cheap. It's often $150 or even less at some times. So it's not like a terrible product that you wouldn't recommend. It's just pretty average. There's nothing much that stands out from the pack with the G24F2. I think I'd probably recommend it over the Pixio PX248 Prime Advanced. So I think it would be sort of a higher C-tier monitor. I think that's pretty fair. C-tier is average, right? G24F2 is pretty average monitor. Let's put it into the C-tier. Next up, we have the Corsair Xeneon 27QHD240. This is another one of the 27-inch 1440p 240Hz W OLED monitors. And immediately, it's not going to make it into either the S or the A tier because this monitor is not as good as the 27GR95QE or the PG27AQDM. Because it has the same panel, there are a lot of similarities to those other monitors, so response time performance, black levels, some aspects to HDR performance are similar to those other monitors, but it has some drawbacks, especially compared to the LG monitor, which is probably its closest equivalent. So things like lower SDR brightness. HDR brightness is pretty similar to the LG model, but overall a little lesser for like SDR brightness. There's a few software quirks as well with that particular product. It did have decent calibration, HDMI 2.1. It's one of the few of these type of monitors that has a 3-year burn-in warranty, but it had underwhelming HDR accuracy. The LG monitor is much more accurate in terms of things like EOTF tracking. So if you're spending a lot of money on an HDR premium monitor, I think this is probably one of the weaker options that I tested throughout this year. I probably wouldn't recommend it. Again, it depends on the price. It is recommendable at a certain price, at a low price, but most of the time I would much prefer to get the LG model if I was after a sort of lower cost version to use this WOLED panel, or very much the PG27AQDM if you're going all out to get best of the best. So I think this is a C tier product. I think that's probably where it lands. B tier is also a possibility, maybe the lower ranks of the B tier, but I think C tier sounds fair to me. And I would have this as a higher ranking in the C tier than probably the G24F2. But again, it's much of a muchness maybe between those two products. I think it's probably clearly ahead of the Pixio. But again, we're talking about very different classes of products, so it's difficult to rank them in a specific order there. So yeah, that's where I'd have that one. Next up, we have the Samsung Odyssey Neo G7 LS43, and this immediately is an F tier monitor. This monitor sucked. One of the big issues with this product, I mean, it's a 43-inch 4K 144Hz VA monitor. It was priced at around $1,000 MSRP. And for that price, you're expecting a premium monitor. You're expecting a high-quality product. And this monitor had awful motion performance, just horrible black level smearing. And this is something that Samsung themselves have fixed and solved with some of their other VA monitors. The 32-inch and 27-inch higher-tier monitors, the Neo G7, the G7, products like that have solved VA motion performance, and this particular monitor did not, and that was really disappointing. It also had things like poor viewing angles, otherwise reasonable in some areas. It had 360 zone FALD in backlight, so you could get some entry-level HDR there, but it's very expensive, and you could often just buy like a 42-inch discounted OLED, which is much better than this particular monitor. I found it very difficult to recommend. I think this monitor needed a lot more work, and it did get heavily discounted at parts throughout the year, but even at heavy discounts, it's just not a good product. F tier for sure. Another product that immediately belongs into the F tier is the Acer Nitro XV272U W2. This is a terrible, terrible product. Some of the issues with this one: poor quality control. When I bought this off Amazon, it arrived with backlight flickering that was noticeable, pretty replicable, and I saw some comments from other users that also had bought this monitor that had received the exact same issue. So poor quality control for this particular product. It also had poor response tuning and poor factory calibration, no sRGB mode despite being a wide gamut monitor. It was cheap. I bought it at around $300 US, which is a good price for a 27-inch 1440p 240Hz IPS, but I just can't recommend it because it was almost broken. Like, honestly, things like backlight flickering, not good. Definitely F tier product. Don't buy that. Really disappointing because of its high quality value, but yeah, just didn't deliver in terms of any of its performance characteristics. The Acer Predator X27U is another 27-inch 1440p 240Hz WOLED monitor. So again, similar to the three others that we've ranked so far in terms of its performance. Things like brightness, pretty similar to the LG and to the Corsair models. Black levels, again, pretty similar, uses the same panel coding, same sort of response time performance. If I was evaluating this purely based on the launch review, this would probably be a D tier product. There was quite a number of issues with it, from its, just things like not coming with uniform brightness mode and various other issues. Yeah, it just wasn't really recommendable. But since they did update it through a firmware update, they fixed some of the issues with the product, and it makes it easier to recommend. So D tier, I think, is no longer fair, and we're probably looking at a C tier product. Brightness is okay, again, not at the Asus level. It does have some annoying like HDR switching issues. You have to change a lot of things between the HDR and SDR modes as you go back and forth. But it is quite cheap. Like it's one of the more affordable monitors to use this panel, often being cheaper than the Corsair product. And with that firmware update, it is certainly usable. I think I'd probably rank this in the C tier, and I think it's probably there. I think it's probably not as good as the Corsair. Again, it's probably much of a muchness. It's hard to rank those products in my opinion, but it's not as good as the LG, not as good as the Asus for sure. C tier seems fair to me after the firmware update, and it shows just why monitor manufacturers should be updating the firmware of their products. It would have been D tier, maybe E tier, if it wasn't updated. Next up is the Philips Evnia 34 M2 C8600 34-inch 1440p class 21:9 monitor, 175Hz QD OLED panel. So this uses the exact same panel as the MSI 342C and the Samsung OLED G8. In my opinion, though, it's not as good as either of those two products. It did have this interesting ambiglow design on the back, so you could get much better ambient lighting from the RGB LEDs on the back than you would see from other products. So that's kind of a unique standout thing that you do get with this particular Philips monitor, but it had quite inaccurate HDR performance, especially compared to some of the other products that I've looked at, and just general issues in that mode. And in terms of its value and pricing, I just wasn't overly impressed with that aspect. In a lot of regions, it was more expensive than you'd be looking at, from either like an Alienware model or from the OLED G8. Again, it depends on the exact region you're talking about. But yeah, I mean, if you're going to get a QD OLED monitor, you have around $1,000 US to spend. I think you're better placed buying some of the other products, in which case I'd probably have this as a C tier monitor. Again, I think it's better than the Pixio, so let's move the Pixio down. Let's move the Philips up. I think that is looking okay to me. It's probably, again, some of these products is a much of a muchness. They're not bad. Like there's a lot of aspects to them that are quite impressive, and I would even recommend them if pricing is really good in your region. So I think that eliminates like the lower tiers, but again, just doesn't get into the high tiers at the moment. MSI MAG274UPF. This is a brighter and more efficient version of the 27-inch 4K 144Hz IPS LCDs that we've had previously, but it wasn't overly impressive to me. Not great motion performance or tuning, though it was adequate. Decent color performance. However, its pricing was a little off. It debuted at like $600 US. It should have been closer to $500 US for this level of performance and characteristics. It's similar to some of the lower cost 4K 27-inch monitors that we've seen, which these days are priced closer to $500. I don't think it is a D tier product. These are probably things that, are just not easy to recommend, not great, not recommendable. I think if the pricing is right for a product like this, that it could be worth recommending depending on how you evaluate things like motion performance. So, you're probably looking at towards the lower part of the C tier or the upper part of the D tier. I think it's probably a C tier monitor because it's just average. There's nothing that's really going for it. There's nothing that's pushing me to say, go get that monitor. It's just a typical average 4K 144Hz IPS LCD that's fine. So I think this is where I'd be having this monitor at the moment. Next up, the LG 32GR93U. Reasonably impressive, this monitor. This is a 32-inch 4K 144Hz IPS LCD, and I think LG genuinely put in a bit of effort to tune this monitor quite well. So things like response time performance is well tuned, giving you, peak that you would expect from this sort of IPS LCD in terms of, response times. It has great factory tuning. That's one thing that's going for it. Excellent sRGB mode, hardware calibration support, no real HDR hardware, and it was a bit expensive at launch in some regions, but pricing I think has improved in that regard, and it is quite good value depending on the region that you're looking at. So I think this is quite a good monitor. Probably, it's not amazing. Like, is it an A tier monitor? Is this the monitor that I'd recommend for people buying a 4K 144Hz IPS LCD? I mean, it could be. There's the M32U as well that I've often recommended. This product is a little better than that. It is better than the Lenovo Y32P30. It's at times cheaper and performs better, especially if you can get it for like $700 US. So this is probably an upper B tier monitor or a lower A tier monitor. I think it could be A tier, B tier, A tier. I don't know. I think I would recommend it in some circumstances, in which case it's probably, again, A tier feels pretty high. I think I'll put it into the most upper part of the B tier. I think that's probably where I've have it. Again, it's not like it's a standout performer. So things like, motion performance is not that much better than something like the Lenovo. Its color performance is not that much better. It doesn't have a ton of unique features. It's good though. It is worth buying. I'd probably have it similar to like an X-G27AQ MR. It's more of a premium monitor with those specifications that is worth buying if you're willing to spend a bit extra money. So I think that makes sense. The MSI G274QPX. This is a decent performer for a 27-inch 1440p 240Hz IPS. Average response times and optimization, no single overdrive mode experience, but when you're talking about lower cost 240Hz IPS monitors, that's pretty typical. Things like M27QX is in a very similar boat. And one of the advantages that this monitor has is that it did come at an excellent price. As low as $330 US, I think the MSRP is $380 US, $350 is very typical, and that's a great price for 1440p 240Hz. It has high brightness, good colors, very good IPS contrast ratio. So I think a lot of those combinations would have it put into the A tier. It would be an S tier monitor if it was, say, tuned better, if it had that single overdrive mode experience. I think that would really have taken it to the next level and would have made it a slam dunk recommendation like you would want from the S tier. But it certainly is a very easy to recommend product for people buying a 1440p 240Hz monitor. It's great value, and I highly rate monitors that are great value. So I'd have it in the A tier. I think it would probably go ahead of the XL2566K. Probably not as good as these monitors. These are better overall performers and good value as well. I think in the A tier around that position, it would make a lot more sense. So that's probably where I'd rank it for now. The Gigabyte M27U. This is your typical 4K monitor, 27-inch 4K 160Hz IPS with average performance, okay optimization, excellent response times, reasonable factory calibration, nothing overly special, but no deal breaker flaws either. So this is just balanced across a lot of areas to performance. And based on that, I would say that, you're looking at an average monitor, probably C tier or D tier, B tier, depending on exactly how I was ranking and seeing those levels of performance. But one of the things that really elevates the M27U is its value. This is one of the cheapest 4K 27-inch monitors that you can get, which I think makes it rank highly in my opinion, especially with that balanced level of performance. If I think about other 4K monitors around this price, it's probably one of the easy to recommend ones, similar to something like an M28U, the predecessor to this monitor. So I think at the very least, it's a B tier product. I think because of its value, I would elevate it into the A tier as a product that it's probably a go-to recommendation for 27-inch 4K without HDR hardware. In the past, I think I've ranked the M28U in the S tier. You'd probably have to go back and have a look at my previous reviews to see exactly where it fell. But the M27U, I don't think elevates into the S tier because the value isn't overly different to what we've seen from some of those previous 4K monitors like the M28U. So it debuts at a great price, but it isn't the extremely good value that the M28U was. And on top of that, I think we're going to be seeing a few more 4K monitors with mini LED that could be competitive with the M27U on pricing, which is going to be difficult for that monitor because it doesn't have actual HDR hardware. So for now, I think it's an A tier product, probably towards the lower part of this segment here, probably below the BenQ monitor. So I think it really fits into that A tier in that position. At least that's where I'd have it. Another 4K monitor from LG is the 27GR93U, 27-inch 4K 144Hz IPS. This is, again, not a groundbreaking monitor, but reasonably impressive, good response time tuning with a single overdrive mode experience, good color performance, sRGB mode, hardware calibration support, mediocre contrast. So it's a good monitor. It probably outperforms the M27U from memory. Don't quote me on that. You can check the reviews to find more information on that. It is a better performer, but it's also typically more expensive. And in some regions, quite expensive. In some regions, quite good value. So variable price, it's typically okay in terms of its pricing. So this is a monitor that in some circumstances I would recommend, but probably doesn't get as strong of a recommendation as the M27U. It's a good buy though, not not a default recommendation. It's probably high B tier based on that. So similar to things like 32Gi93U, XG27AQMR. If you want to pay that little bit more for a bit better performance, I think it probably slots into like here, for example, in the tier list. XG27AQMR probably impressed me a little more. The 32-inch model, there's less good quality 32-inch 4K monitors. So I think the LG, the 32-inch model elevates itself a little bit. The 27-inch, there's more higher quality monitors, M27U being one example. So I think middle of the B tier makes the most sense for that monitor. Okay, we're up to the final 6 monitors for our ranking, and we're going to start in this section with the AOC Agon Pro AG276QZD, which is another 1440p 27-inch 240Hz WOLED monitor, similar to the Corsair, the Acer, the LG, and the Asus models. What I was really impressed with this model is that it had a similar WOLED experience to the LG model, for example. So few annoyances, not quite as good HDR brightness as the Asus model, a few software things that could have been improved, but similar WOLED experience. So brightness, black levels, response times, all very similar to those other monitors. And it had quite good SDR brightness, I think higher than the LG model, more in line with the Asus model. It didn't have the Asus model's excellent HDR brightness, but it performed really well. But the thing that really, I think, makes this monitor step up compared to some of those other monitors was its price. At launch, and I believe still to this day, this is one of the cheapest monitors with these specifications. Other monitors have slightly adjusted over time to come more in line with the AOC, which I believe was available for below $800. I can't remember the exact price, but it was quite cheap. So, immediately for me, if I'm ranking it up against the other monitors, it's a better performing monitor than the X27U and the 27Q HD240. It doesn't perform as well in things like HDR, EOTF tracking, and a few other things compared to the LG monitor and the Asus monitor. So compared to those, those are probably the two better options, but its value is really good. So I'd recommend this monitor for a lot of people that, let's say, for example, you didn't want to spend the $1,000 to get the Asus model, but you still were interested in getting a WOLED and you wanted a bit better bang for buck. Then I think the AOC makes a lot of sense. So it certainly is an A-tier product. The question would be, how high up in the A tier are we going to put it? Is it above the LG model? Is it above the Samsung OLED G8? I think, all these monitors offer pretty good value. I think I'd have it. XL2566K is quite a good monitor for its niche. I think I'd probably put it there. It feels harsh though to have it ranked a couple of monitors behind this model, because it depends on the pricing in your region as to whether I'd recommend the LG or the AOC. I could even recommend the AOC over the LG depending on pricing. But I think because the LG is the overall better monitor in terms of performance, and we can't always rank things purely on price, then I think it is A tier, probably in that range. It's pretty hard to rank a 27-inch 1440p OLED up against a 24-inch TN LCD designed for esports. It's pretty hard. So probably something around there makes sense. Another monitor from LG that I thought was reasonable this year, the LG 27GR83Q. This was their 27-inch 1440p 240Hz IPS LCD, and it was a very solid monitor with these specifications. Okay response times with a borderline single overdrive mode experience, good sRGB mode, great calibration features, HDMI 2.1. So typically that gave it a better overall performance and experience compared to, let's say, the G274QPX that we've ranked up here in the A tier, better than, say, the M27QX as well, that we have ranked previously quite highly from Gigabyte. So it's a good monitor. It performs well. The downside to this being that it was expensive in some regions at some times. I have heard some people able to buy this monitor for around the same price as the G274QPX on sale. So at a sale price, it's probably would rank more highly than the MSI model because it's better. And if it's the same price, you would just get the LG model. But generally speaking, it wasn't as good value. So across most of the year, the MSI model was cheaper and offered better bang for buck, but the LG model is still worth considering in a lot of scenarios because of its increased performance. So from that perspective, it's not an average monitor, so it's not C tier. I think this is a B tier monitor. The question is how high up into the B tier, especially compared to, we've talked about the premium offerings that you can sometimes get, like the LG, the 32-inch model, 4K, 27-inch 4K model, the Asus 300 Hertz IPS. It's not as good as that particular monitor in terms of performance. Whether or not it tends to be a bit cheaper to buy the LG compared to the Asus. Yeah, is it better than the G274QPF? Possibly. Certainly is probably ranked in sort of the middle here. I think I'd have it here. I think I'd have it not quite as good as the Asus. A ranking somewhere around there probably makes the most sense for me. Something like that in sort of the middle of the B tier for the 27GR83Q. That's where I would have it. All right, Asus ROG Swift OLED PG49WCD. This is the only 49-inch super ultra-wide monitor that I tested this year with a 1440p class resolution, though it is 5120 by 1440, 32 by 9 aspect ratio, so it's kind of that double 27-inch 1440p form factor in the one panel, 144Hz refresh rate, and QD-OLED performance. So QD-OLED panel type, so all the expected QD-OLED panel characteristics. It is a second-gen QD-OLED, so that did bring with it some improvements to text clarity. It had slightly better screen coding, things like that. It wasn't amazing in terms of its HDR performance. It was better in, it did have this sort of brightness and those sort of characteristics that we've come to love from QD-OLED, as well as the black depth and things like that. But some of its tuning wasn't amazing. But I think the main issue for this panel was that other 49-inch QD-OLED super ultra-wides were being released with a 240Hz refresh rate, like the OLED G9 that I haven't reviewed yet from Samsung, whereas this monitor, for some reason, was 144Hz. Didn't make a lot of sense for this to be a 144Hz monitor. When it came to pricing, it wasn't that compelling either. I think it was only $100 US cheaper than the current pricing for the Samsung model. The Samsung G9 pricing does fluctuate a little bit, but yeah, if you're going to be offering a 144Hz refresh rate up against a 240Hz model, that makes it a little hard to recommend, and I think it needed a bit more tweaking in some areas as well. It's not a terrible product, so it's not like E or F tier, and it's not as bad as like a Xeneon Flex, for example. It's just not amazing. I just wasn't all that enthused with it. I think if it was a 240Hz model, so it had the exact same characteristics but was 240Hz, you'd probably be looking at C or B tier, depending. But yeah, with its HDR performance, with its lack of refresh rate, and it's, you're spending a lot of money on that product, I think most people would be more inclined just to go for a 240Hz option, get the kind of best for best and future-proof it a little bit. So yeah, unfortunately, PG49WCD, not that great. The Asus ROG Swift Pro PG248QP was a very impressive monitor, but it has some of the same issues as the XL2566K from BenQ in that this is a very niche product. If we're assessing it based on, is an esports gamer going to be really happy with this monitor? The answer is yes. It has outstanding motion performance. It has a 540Hz refresh rate, which is super high. It has ULMB2 backlight strobing, which is really good in terms of its motion clarity. However, it's a 24-inch 1080p TN panel, so for most gamers, that's probably not going to be adequate. It has poor TN panel characteristics, like viewing angles, for example. It does have good factory calibration, so it's got that going for it. ULMB2 isn't fully compatible with AMD GPUs, which is a downside. It's not widely compatible, which is what we usually like to see from monitors. And I think the main issue with this monitor is that it is very, very expensive. It's like $900 US, which I think for a lot of people makes it very difficult to recommend. Even for pro esports gamers, I think because the XL2566K is like a $550 to $600 US monitor, that a lot of people would probably prefer it over the PG248QP because it's cheaper and with backlight strobing is going to deliver similar, not quite as good in some areas, but very similar motion performance. So yeah, it ultimately comes down to, in terms of ranking, do I rank it based on best of the best? Because I think as far as 1080p monitors go, it probably is the best of the best 1080p monitor. However, because it's so expensive, and I think most people would probably prefer this monitor, it's probably towards the bottom part of the A tier. I think I can't justify B or C tier. It's too good in terms of its motion performance. It's too good in terms of what it sets out to achieve, which is being that pro performance esports monitor. But again, it's just so hard to recommend at the price. Even A tier seems difficult to justify based on it being like $900 US. I think, I'm really torn on that one because of its performance versus its price. Yeah, I don't know. I think bottom part of the A tier, let's just leave it in there for now because I'll be torn between putting it somewhere else. We'll move on to the Cooler Master Tempest GP2711. This is another immediate F tier monitor. Monitor's not good. Not good at all. Has terrible HDR performance despite its mini LED backlight. It was way too dark, unusably dark for a lot of HDR gaming, which is really the whole point of the monitor. It has poor SDR calibration, very slow VA response times as well. So it's a 27-inch 1440p 165Hz VA with a 576 zone mini LED backlight, but it has a lot of backlight smearing from the VA panel, which just isn't what you want from a modern VA LCD. That's a solved problem. VA smearing is a solved problem. Monitors should not be shipping with that in 2023. It is affordable. I think it was MSRP of $450 US. I don't think it's quite released yet, but between its terrible HDR performance that is far too dark for gaming, between its poor SDR calibration and very slow response times, there's just no way that you would consider buying this monitor. It's probably the worst monitor that the Acer model had quality control issues. It's a tough one. Would I put it ahead of the Acer? The Acer is somewhat usable in some scenarios. I think this one's just a fail for HDR gaming. I just can't recommend it. I think it's at the bottom of the F tier, yeah. And the final monitor that I'm looking at this year is the Acer Nitro XV275K-P3. This is a 27-inch 4K 160Hz IPS LCD with a 576 zone mini LED backlight. This one, definitely a mixed bag. It has fast response times for an LCD of this class, single overdrive mode experience. It has decent HDR performance, high brightness, good dimming, good RGB mode, which I think, based on a lot of those things, you'd probably be thinking B tier, A tier, that sort of thing. But this has very annoying software issues. So the HDR SDR switching, which is also an issue with the X27U, where when you switch from the SDR mode to the HDR mode, you have to change a lot of settings to get it into an adequately performing mode. That's pretty annoying. And this is significantly exacerbated by the terrible OSD controls. It uses face buttons, not a directional control, which is difficult to navigate, and it's very, very slow to use. It is good value. It does have an MSRP, I think, of around $700 or $800 US, but it can be found as low as $550 at times, which is similar pricing to the M27U, but with HDR performance. So with this monitor, in the review, it really came down to, can you live with the software annoyances or not? If you can't live with them, it's a bad product that you shouldn't buy. If you don't think those things will be super annoying, then it could be worth buying so you can access the true HDR experience at a decent price. For me though, I think the software issues are too annoying, and I think that if I was using this monitor and I had to constantly do that switching through the horribly slow OSD, and because it's still only an entry to mid-range HDR product, I think I ultimately wouldn't recommend it, especially if it's anything above its $550 price. So I think I'd have it at the top of the D tier for me. Again, I could potentially justify C tier as well, but top of the D tier, I think anything D, E, and F tier are sort of the products that I, in most scenarios, would not recommend. C tier is like I could recommend it depending on the price and other characteristics, but there are better products available. And then when we start getting to B, A, and S tier, these are like the recommendable products at certain prices depending on what you want. A tier, definitely recommended. S tier, excellent elite tier product. So I think being a D tier monitor sort of makes the most sense. So I guess those are my rankings for the year. Let's just have a look at where things ended up. So at the end of the day, throughout the year, of the 30 monitors that I tested, I've got 9 monitors that I didn't end up recommending in the D, E, and F tiers, which means that there were 21 monitors that for the most part were anywhere from average to good, which I think is a pretty good result. Although I guess when I'm selecting monitors to review, I'm more inclined to look at monitors that have some sort of characteristic that I could say is potentially good for people to buy. Like if it's the cheapest monitor, has some unique specifications or does something interesting, then it's like more likely to test it. So I guess that's probably why we're swinging a little more into the A, B tier sort of monitors. But I think as we look across these, there are genuinely lots of good monitors released this year. We've got a couple of OLED 27-inch 240Hz OLEDs. We've got the OLED G8, another great monitor. We've got some good value products like the G274QPX M27U. This is another great value product, but it is a WOLED as well. And then we get the two really good esports monitors that, if you have the price and you want to, if you have the money, you want to spend big on a product, then it would sort of make sense. But yeah, I think, it's looking pretty good. We've got a range of other monitors that sort of, offered something for some people depending on the price point and where it's positioned. And then, some average monitors as well. So I think overall that's a pretty good result. I'll have to go back and have a look at where other years fell in terms of rankings, how many we had in A, B, and C tier. I think in some previous years we had a few more S tier products. So things that were like revolutionary good value. I remember there were products in previous years that I'd put in there because of its revolutionary good value. This year we had more continuation of good value, of matching the value of other products, but offering a little bit more. So less likely to have S tier products, but overall, plenty for people to buy, plenty of things in a lot of different categories, which I think is always a good thing. So that does it for the 2023 monitor tier list rankings. Thanks for watching this long video. If you do appreciate these types of videos, I know a lot of you love the tier list ranking video at the end of the year, then let me know in the comments below and we'll come back in 2024 and do it all again when we test more monitors. This year, I tested more monitors than the previous 2 years. So I think it was mid-20s in terms of monitors throughout the previous 2 years. This year, 30 monitors. So that is all possible thanks to the support from our Patreon and Floatplane supporters. So if you do want to support the channel and all the testing that we do, all these independent reviews that we create throughout the year, then the best way to do that is via Patreon or Floatplane. It allows us to buy some of the monitors that we've tested throughout the year. There's, half a dozen monitors here that we purchased, maybe even more than that. I'd have to go back and assess that, but plenty of monitors that we purchase with funds directly from your support. So thanks everyone for watching this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll catch you in the next one.